Welcome to Measure for Measure. I'm Ulkar, and here I'm hosting conversations with musicians and music scholars about classical and ethnic music. My goal with these conversations is to bring out the usually unspoken aspects of musical performance, what's going on in the mind of performing musicians as they work through a piece of music, how they make sense of it, how they interpret it. And I find that learning about these things can greatly enrich listening experience, and this is what I want to share here. So my guest today is cellist Philip Sheegog, who is one of the most versatile musicians I know. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you. So glad to be here.
Yeah, me too. So let's get started with you telling us about your background and how you came to pick cello as your instrument of choice, and maybe also some of your recent projects.
All right, so story of my life. We'll keep the early years quick and Spark Notes style. So essentially how I got into music is I am the third of three kids, grew up in Southern California, and when I was 5, musical inspiration struck me, and I knew that I wanted to play the drums. And Mama Sheegog said, no, I don't want to have drums in my house. And so my inspiration was cut off at the root. But a couple of years later, my middle sister had started taking violin lessons. And her teacher had a colleague who taught cello in the Orange County area where I was growing up. And so, schemes were hatched and plotted between my sister's violin teacher and my mom. And they began a ruthless campaign of indoctrination to convince Philip that Mom really wanted Philip to just play the cello. Right. And so I jest, of course, but that's how I started cello, is through that connection with my sister's teacher. And so I started playing when I was 8, and then we'll kind of compress the rest of my conservatory life. I was a pretty straight shooter. I was a Suzuki kid, so studying that pedagogy and Western classical music, and started excelling in that to the point where I eventually came out here to New York almost exactly 10 years ago. 2 days ago was my 10-year New York anniversary. So that was when I moved in and started at Juilliard for my undergrad degree. And some seeds had been planted in high school, but really started developing when I was at conservatory, of me starting to explore, at first, the edges of classical music through the world of contemporary classical music, which is a beautifully nebulous term that encompasses all the stuff that's being written now by living composers, but is often tangential to experimental music, tangential to free improvisation. A lot of these different ways of approaching and thinking about music that were at that point kind of adventurous compared to the training that I'd come from, which was very notated, very steeped in tradition, repertoire, all of that. And that kind of became my gateway drug, so to speak, into exploring even further outside those bounds of music. And so what that eventually led to is I met another Juilliard-trained musician, Jonathan Myron, who you know well, a violinist, and both of us had kind of fallen off the classical music wagon in our own ways. And so when we met through a jam session, discovered that there was a lot of both musical synergy, but also shared vision for what we hope the future of classical music in society can look like. And so we teamed up about 5 years ago. We created a band called Archive, that you know what we're doing, where we are very much fusing the tradition of our training with many more musical influences, music that we love of different genres and styles, be that film scores or electronic dance music or classic rock or progressive metal, kind of putting that all together and creating something that is kind of hard to define, but we like, and our hope is that it connects to a broad range of audiences through that. So that's kind of the spark notes of how I got to where I am.
Awesome. Each episode we'll be talking about a piece of music chosen by the guest musician, and Philip is going to be playing a solo cello piece by Caroline Shaw called in manus tuas. So let's go ahead with this and then delve into discussion about the piece.
Sounds good.
So this was genuinely the very best performance of this piece that I've ever heard in my life. So huge thanks for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And let's now talk about the origin story of this piece, how it came about.
Sure. So I actually first learned this piece because I had the opportunity to play for Caroline Shaw in a masterclass at a music festival I was at. So I was not aware of the piece before that, but wanted to learn as much as I could prior to, playing for her. So as best I know it, Caroline wrote this piece when she was, I believe, in a chapel at Yale, written for her friend Hannah Collins, who's actually a friend of mine as well. She's an amazing cellist. And it was kind of trying to capture her experience of hearing music in that space. And so the music itself is attempting to not only capture sound but space itself. And the piece, or the title in Manus tuas, is a reference to a Thomas Tallis motet of the same name, which appears in a sort of quotation fragmented form in the center of her piece, and then in an extremely fragmented form at the end, of course. But what I find, one of the many things I find beautiful about this piece is there's such an organic quality to it. Actually, in the score notes, it expresses that she originally wrote the score by hand, and there's some notations that she kind of made into digital form to put on the engraved version, but some of these slurs, some scribble markings noting these kind of morphs into noise and unpitched sound. Right. But just the entire nature of the piece to me has this kind of undulating, cohesive mass to it, where it feels almost like an organic object, as opposed to some music which feels very kind of like brick by brick constructed. This piece, and a lot of Caroline's music in general, I find to have an extremely organic, evolving nature to it, which I find really compelling.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And also it's interesting the setting for which it was intended to be performed, right?
Yes.
It's like as a secular solo cello compline service held in a dark candlelit nave.
Yeah. And to that point, as you just heard, and as everyone just heard, the way that I just played that piece was attempting to emulate more of that space, or to capture in the performance, right? We're here in your beautiful apartment. But of course, the sonic experience of that piece, I always imagine, is intended for, right, a massive stone cathedral, ideally from the Middle Ages, right? Because those stones sound better. But so what I just did in this performance was actually just integrating some technology so that the actual sound of the cello was being processed through. It's actually a reverb that is sampled from an actual old cathedral. So there is a little bit of like old stone in there.
Yeah.
But that space, that reverb that I was able to inject into the sound, I think really affects the way that the music comes across, right? Some of these solitary notes have lives that extend far beyond just the single pizzicato or bow stroke when they are reverberating for 10 seconds and creating almost their own lines of voice, you might even think, right? Yeah. Thinking of the Tallis motets. So that's just a way that I love to approach pieces like this, using the tools that we have now, right? Integrating the beautiful old instruments, but also the technology at our fingertips.
Yeah, and that makes for an excellent result in the end, for sure. And also, like, this is actually not a piece for a solo cello, technically speaking, but for almost like a vocalizing cellist, right? Because there are parts where you sing. But I'm a bit surprised that I almost want that there were more space for vocalization, because it only appears, it seems, in the first third of the piece, and then kind of disappears, right?
Yeah.
So, and like, also I'm reminded of, my voice teacher told me that apparently voice students are told to emulate the sound of string instruments, whereas string players are told to emulate human voice.
Always.
And they are often not even aware of this circularity, and only they like attend each other's master classes that they become aware of this. But like in this case, there's like a marriage of human voice and a string instrument, and like they're together expressing something that I think it's told that Caroline Shaw often in her music is kind of stretching out experience of a single moment of time, or in this case, like also trying to express experience of music through music itself.
Yeah.
So I find that they were beautiful. Maybe we can talk about all the spectrum of extended techniques that she has used in this piece.
For sure.
Yeah.
So there are a couple of like expressly extended techniques. The vocalizing is not yet that common, so I'd call that a sort of extended technique. It's actually really quite tricky with some of these long notes that she has written, to prepare the diaphragm for a long note and hopefully staying in tune while doing these kind of sustained flowing gestures. That actually was tricky to work on when I was first learning this piece, but I'd call that an extended technique. And then she also notably has these in the score, they're literally scribbles, but to emulate or to try to notate going from a full pitched note to this kind of scratchy, wispy thing, which to me feels like a sort of almost as if there's a memory, and the memory's kind of like crumbling and fading away, and that achieves it through sound. And so that I would consider it an extended technique. But interestingly, it's juxtapositioned with very traditional techniques, right? A lot of these, a lot of the piece is done through these barilage gestures that are, in my mind, very related to like Baroque or Renaissance music.
Yeah, it reminds me of the chaconne, of course.
Oh, the chaconne, of course, or like gamba, right? All these beautiful flowing string crossing movements. And I know Caroline is heavily influenced by early Western music, right? Renaissance, even this is based off of a Thomas Tallis motet. So, which is just a beautiful pairing for me. Is like the very old, the very new, and kind of merging them together.
Yeah, and also there are a couple of moments where the sounds almost like metallic. Can you describe how you achieve that effect?
Yeah, so that actually is something that's not expressly notated in the score. The effect is sol ponticello, and that's right where the bow goes extremely close to where the bridge is, and so the string can't fully vibrate, and so we get so many overtones that it starts to sound kind of metallic. There's a section of the piece that is notated in an approximation. There's these boxes where she has some instructions and says, like, play this figure a certain number of times. You get to choose kind of between, I think, like 6 and 10 times, and explore sound within that. And I remember when I played it for her, that was one of the things that we worked on together was she was encouraging me to explore further the range of timbral possibilities within each of those little chunks. Which one of the ways we can do that when we're keeping the notes the same is to explore where our bow is. And so moving between these very dark, almost muffled sounds when we go sol tasto to the very bright metallic sol ponticello. And then for me, the thing I'm adding that she probably hadn't thought of was adding varying amounts of reverb. And so I'm pushing the sound further back into our imaginary space and then bringing it closer to almost achieve that feeling of like if you were walking in the furthest reaches of the cathedral and you're just hearing pure reflections versus if you then got closer. And so that's another one of those parameters that I've just injected in. And I think she'd be okay with that.
Yeah, oh, definitely. It's an excellent effect. Also, I'm curious about the very last section because it seems like it's quoting this motif, but it's kind of stumbling and stopping without finishing and then starting again. So what do you think is that indicative of what's going on there?
From my interpretation, and again, she might have a completely different purpose for that section, but for me, again, it feels like that sort of allusion to memory. When memories become fragmented or certain parts of it replay more than others, you get stuck in a loop. Some things are harder to remember, some things are extremely bold and jump out. And so there's these extremely fragmented parts of the quoted melody, but they're coming at different timings, different amounts of space. Some are marked to be suddenly loud and suddenly soft. And that's just kind of how I feel that we've kind of gone on this journey of exploration. We've heard the melody kind of in its closest form to its purity. And then we go on another journey of these swirling musical gestures. And then we're trying to remember that as the memory almost fades in its purity, right? It's like the more that we remember something, right, actually the more diluted the authenticity of that memory becomes. I think that's like come out of some neuroscience research. You're the scientist, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong. Right. And then we end, of course, the same way we began, which is kind of these almost like fading in and out of dust as the recesses of our mind. I don't know, maybe we're fading in and out of consciousness back to sleep. The dream evaporates. I don't know, something like that. So
I usually ask musicians for recommendations of recordings of the piece that they've just played. So do you have any favorite recordings, or how do you think this piece is intended to be experienced? Yeah, so one of the challenges with more contemporary music is it can sometimes be hard to find it programmed on concerts that you'll go and see, just because, right, they aren't as well known, they haven't been circulating as long. But whenever I'm working on or trying to get to know new music, I always love to see if I can find the person for whom it was written, just because it's such a unique thing to hear the interpreter who got to work with the composer. And so I believe Hannah has a recording, or there's a performance of hers that is on YouTube that I remember studying when I was first learning the piece. So I'll always recommend go and hear Hannah Collins perform it, because she got to work with Caroline Shaw on the piece. So I would always recommend that. If the opportunity comes to hear this piece performed in a massive cathedral, I would absolutely recommend going to see that. I'm not sure if that's happening anytime. But that's one of the beautiful things, but also the challenging things about new music. Is like you don't necessarily know where you're going to be able to hear it. But for this piece, I would definitely, if you get a chance to hear it live, or if you have a cellist friend who you can recommend to play it live for you, do that. Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. Such a pleasure to be here. Absolutely. Thank you so much.